The anxious Democrat establishment asks, is there anyone else? Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com, as well as our friends over at the Patriot Post, America's News Digest. If you haven't checked out the Patriot Post yet, we'll provide a link in the description below. You're going to be glad you did. Gentlemen, this is an interesting headline because this is the New York Times, the paper of record, the gray lady, the trendsetter, the agenda setter for the American news business. Under this headline, which sounds really startling, anxious Democratic establishment. That's the source here, right? Listen to the lead. When a half dozen Democrat donors gathered at the Whitby Hotel in Manhattan last week, the dinner began with a discussion of which presidential candidates the contributors liked. But as a conversation among influential Democrats often go these days, the meeting quickly evolved into a discussion of who was not in the race but could be lured in. A half dozen Democrat donors. This is the genesis of this story that says the Democratic establishment. So apparently, there were 6 people who constitute the Democratic establishment, and they went on to suggest that these people were asking, could Hillary Clinton get in? How about Michael Bloomberg? One of them even mentioned Michelle Obama. And by the way, to excuse the phrase, but Michelle has been my dark horse for a long time. I think Michelle is the ultimate salvation of the Democratic Party in this thing, or at least if they want somebody who can lose this thing with panache and dignity. So I find it interesting, though, gentlemen, not that Democrats are having their quadrennial conversation about, gee, I, as they would say on Arrested Development, I think I've made a horrible mistake. But the fact that the New York Times is playing up the fact that the Democrat donors and establishment punditocracy is concerned about the field that they have out there. And then I turned on CNN, and the first thing I saw on CNN was John King's show in a panel discussion talking about, well, maybe we could find somebody else to run in this race. Stephen Green, you've been following this game for a long time. Is there anything different in this cycle about these Democratic doubts? And frankly, what do you think of the fact that the New York Times, the progressive banner for the Democratic Party, is
party
playing
house
this up?
organ is what it is.
Yeah.
I loved the New York Times report on this story. Although I'll tell you what it reminds me of a little bit. I think it was an old Life in Hell comic strip. Matt Groening before he started The Simpsons had this great comic strip that I just love. Maybe he's still doing it. I have no idea. But the little kid bunny rabbit character, he drew bunny rabbits because he was terrible at drawing human beings. And if you've seen The Simpsons, he never got much better at it. But that's not where the comedy is sitting there on the floor at the end of Christmas morning. The tree's got all the decorations on it, and the kid is just surrounded by open packages, and there are ribbons on the floor and torn gift wrap and presents and toys just littered everywhere around him. A little kid saying, "So that's it?" And here, this is, no exaggeration. This is kind of the Democratic dream team. They had, at one point, I believe it was 24 announced candidates, 24 candidates. And they ranged, wealth of experience. They had a medium-sized town, small mayor. They've got senators. They've got governors. They've got big city mayors. In terms of experience, they had this huge, broad cross-section of politicians. Oh, and they got a billionaire in there now, too. Maybe 2 billionaires if Bloomberg drops into the race as the next savior of the party, and and talk about a wealth of and a wide spread of views. This it ranges from the far left to the extreme far left. It's really everything a primary voting Democrat could possibly hope for, and they're still not satisfied. And I'll tell you what, this goes back to something I was saying in my segment on Hillary Clinton and this bubble she lives in. They still haven't been able to process, with the exception maybe of Tulsi Gabbard, why they lost in 2016. They just don't understand that the political foundations have shifted. Trump didn't start it. Trump was the first one to recognize it and take advantage of it. But the foundations are shifting. They still haven't settled into their final locations. Well, final for a while anyway. But everything is in motion, and they can't honestly accept this And they're moving further and further left, trying to find where the ground is under their feet now, and they just can't because they don't get it. It's time to come back to the center. And it's not about the candidate who isn't in the race yet. It's the candidate who can do what Donald Trump did and recognize that the ground is shifted, and not a one of them can really see that.
And by the way, with all that brilliance that Stephen just said, I think there's one part of it that I am going to use over and over again, and that is the description of Mayor Pete Buttigieg as a medium town small mayor.
Is that what I said? Oh, clearly I need to start day drinking on right angle taping days because, get a couple of cocktails in me. I don't mess up like that.
Oh, I think that's the most accurate description I've ever heard of him.
You're absolutely right. He's
Bill,
a wee tiny mayor.
When John King was talking on CNN, several of the commentators that he had surrounded himself with in this panel discussion were looking outside of the field, basically, and saying who else could step in. Both Hillary Clinton and Michael Bloomberg have allegedly told associates that if they thought that they could win, they would get into the race. In other words, they're still hankering to do so, and really they're looking for somebody to push them. But John King said something I thought was illuminating. He said, if you're watching a motor race and a car crashes, the car that's in the lead crashes, it's the cars that are on the track then that have a chance of winning. So he's basically saying, why is it that we're looking outside of the current field of candidates when normally you would expect, if the whole discussion was if Joe Biden crashes and burns, then Hillary Clinton gets in, or then Michael Bloomberg gets in, or then, any number of other people. But he's basically saying, why not look within the field? And lately we have seen Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
Dude.
Oh, it's getting better. I'm sorry, Pete. Really, among the candidates in that field, he's probably the most respectable. He and Tulsi Gabbard as far as their comportment. But anyway, Mayor Pete just came in third in a poll in Iowa, and so he's rising in the ranks. And Amy Klobuchar has been getting a lot of media attention lately as well. So these are people who are already in it. They've already invested in it. They've already raised money. And Bill, the Democrats are still looking outside, saying, is there anybody out there, to quote Pink Floyd, is there a fundamental problem with this field, and can it be remedied?
It's kind of like the Democratic National Committee went to the finest restaurant in all of New York and said, we're starving. Which way is your dumpster? And
then they set it on fire.
They take them out back, and then they remove the 20 most delicious items out of the dumpster. And then they find out that nobody wants to eat those either. And then they say, now what do we do? And then the owner of the first restaurant says, well, monsieur, there is a Denny's across the street. You may check that dumpster if you would like. And there you go, it's not necessarily the candidates, although if you were to take the politics out of the candidates, I mean, I know this is a strange sort of thing, but if you take the politics out of the candidates completely and just look at them as potential candidates, the only ones that seem to have like any real visual appeal are Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg, and Elizabeth Warren looks like somebody who's, going to give you detention, and Joe just looks like a guy who just I don't know, box barrage during World War I kind of thing, never was quite the same afterwards. But their problem, Scott, is that you can't take the politics out of it. And their problem continues to be, it is an insoluble problem. And that's good news for us because it's going to mean either the end of the Democratic Party or the end of the Democratic Party as it is today. I don't believe in one party rule. I think we're just as capable of making errors as they are if we had the invisible cloak of protection that the media throws over us. So here's what I think. When your entire political philosophy is virtue signaling, then you can only pull ahead of the pack by virtue signaling louder than the person who's standing next to you. If this was a rational party, was talking about economics, one person might have one plan, another person might say, well, we ran the numbers on these two plans, and mine not only does more, it saves more money, and blah, blah, but that's not what it's about. Since it's about identity politics, the entire competition is about virtue signaling. Who is the most virtuous among us? And that means that each one of them has to top the other. And by topping the other, they have to do two things. First, they have to pull them down morally. And that's just, you've basically cut the legs out from the only thing your candidate has. Joe Biden's kind of a racist, What? And Kamala Harris, basically let innocent people languish in jail. What? By trying to rank each other, by destroying the other person's morality, which they do with Republicans with impunity, they basically defanged themselves. And the bigger issue is that since this virtue signaling has to top each other, perfect example. How many of you out there think that there should be free health care for illegal immigrants? Every single person on the stage raises their hand, right? I bet you 1 in 20 Americans agree with that view. But here's the point. If every single person on that stage says that they're in favor of free health care to illegal immigrants, then the only way to stand out according to their philosophy is to be the one who says, not only that, but I support free sex change operations for illegal immigrants. And then somebody's going to have to top that. And every time this thing happens, the thing moves further and further and further and further off the cliff to the left and further away from that center of what used to be the Democratic Party's base, which was the working man, who has no interest in this whatsoever, and who is looking at a $5,000 increase in the average increase what's the measurement of living? The
take-home pay or
take-home pay, cost of living, all that other stuff. You got $1,000 extra over 8 years of Obama, and in 2-3 years of Trump, you got $5,000 extra. If you think those people are going to abandon that paycheck to follow Elizabeth Warren off to campus someplace, it's not going to happen. No wonder they're looking for somebody else. They're not going to succeed by finding other people. And it's too late this year, but maybe next time they might want to try actual policies other than, we lost because the Russians. They should just go ahead and why don't they simply nominate, I don't know, Gorbachev is still alive. Go straight to the source. If the Russians are going to win the election for you, why are you kind of messing around with American candidates? Get Gorbachev up there. The Russians will put him into power, and then you'll be all set to go.
Hey, Scott, can I throw in one more thing? I meant to say this earlier, why I don't think there will be a late candidate that enters the race, or if they do, they won't be the nominee, or if they are the nominee, they won't win the election. And that is voters, primary voters and general election voters both tend to resent almost these late entry candidates. It's like, okay, if you were so serious about this, where were you last year when everybody else was building their ground organization and doing the hard work of putting together an election campaign? Where were you then? So if one of these candidates does jump in, I don't think they'll get the nomination. If they do, I think they're going to poison the well so badly for the Democrats that Donald Trump won't even have to campaign practically.
There's an old song by the band Alabama that says, the closer you get, the further I fall. I'll be over the edge now in no time at all. And I think that if we twist it a little bit and say, the closer I get, the further you fall, is what's happening with these candidates at this point. The Democrats are frankly have seen enough. They've seen too much. There have been too many debates. There's been too much exposure. That's right. And the problem with the candidates, especially the leading candidates who get the most attention, and the reason why it becomes so fascinating to explore the possibility that we might pull somebody out of the treasure chest of old candidates, or that one of the youngsters who we don't really know really well will rise up, is because we just want something new. I mean, the more I get to know about each of these people, the less appealing they become, which it points out two case studies I was thinking about. Number one is Barack Obama. Barack Obama was successful in large part because of the vagueness of his story. He had a certain patina of Americana, of, like this dream candidate who came from somewhere, we're not quite sure where, and did something we don't know quite what, and then got elected to something where he did nothing, and nobody could really pin him down. So that was very appealing to people because they're like, I like that guy. He looks nice. He's got a nice smile. He speaks really well. I don't know too much about him. There's that famous thing with Tom Brokaw going over and over during one panel discussion where he say, what do we really know about his beliefs? What do we know about what his view of foreign policy is? That was beautiful, and it worked for Barack Obama because Democrats will say, yeah, I could vote for that guy's story. I could vote for my projection of who I think he ought to be. And then the other case study is Donald Trump. Donald Trump came into the race with everybody already knowing too much about him. And so people already knew this is a casino guy and multiple marriages and blah, blah, in New York and, all this kind of what most people would view in the heartland of America as somewhat unsavory associations. But at that point, they're like, how much worse can it get? And so we're willing to pursue this one. At least you don't have to worry about some horrible thing coming out of Donald Trump that's going to
shatter your image of Donald Trump.
It's not really going to happen. And so by the same token, those people kind of embraced him because they're like, okay, well, I've already gotten through that period of exhaustion about him, and I'm not. They're not going to zing me with this guy. And so I think we are at a normal point in the process where Democrats begin to wonder, wow, does it get any better than this? Nobody seems to be getting any serious traction. None of the undercard, so to speak, has been able to rise up. We're seeing a little bit from Buttigieg. We're seeing a little bit from Klobuchar right now. Maybe even Tulsi Gabbard now that she's been willing to stand up on her hind legs and pop Hillary Clinton in the nose.
That was nice.
All of that to say that I agree with Steve. I don't think we're going to get an outside candidate, although I think they would be smart to call in Michelle Obama. But I don't think we're going to get an outside candidate. What we are going to get is a story that we haven't heard yet, that develops around a candidate that brings a certain mystique and charm to that candidate. There's going to have to be something that's going to have to rise up from within their life stories, or in the case of Joe Biden, you just make up something that would make them appealing. Or for that matter, Elizabeth Warren, she made up something too, didn't she?
How?
I think that I think the Democrats desperately need to find somebody they can believe in. And the problem right now is they know too much to believe. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.